My good friend, Dr. Nelson, distinguished platform associates, members of the faculty, and members of the student body of this great institution of learning, ladies and gentlemen. I need not pause to say how very delighted I am to be here tonight and to have the privilege and the high honor of delivering the Gandhi Memorial Lecture. I think this is the second time that I have had an opportunity to deliver this lecture at Howard University. And on receiving the invitation, I felt something like the young lady who had lived in the city all of her life and who had never had the experience of going to a rural community. And the one longing of her life was to be able to go to the country and milk a cow. And so that glad day came when she was able to take this trip to visit her grandmother in a country town. And after getting there, the first thing that she set out to do was to milk this cow that she had always longed to do. And so the grandmother, who was inside of the house, came out and saw her granddaughter with a bucket of milk, desperately seeking to get the cow to drink the milk. She had finished milking the cow, and she was trying to get the cow to drink the milk. And so the grandmother was disturbed and astonished, didn't know what was happening. And so she asked her granddaughter about it. She said, "What's wrong? What are you trying to do? You wanted to milk a cow, and now you've had the opportunity. Why are you trying to get the cow's mouth open and trying to get the cow to drink the milk?" And the granddaughter said, "Well, I did milk the cow, and the milk looked pretty thin to me, and I thought I should try to run it back through a second time. So maybe when I was here before, what I had to say was pretty thin. And Dr. Nelson felt that I should come back and try to run it back through a second time." But in all seriousness, I'm delighted to be here. I always feel like being at home, coming home when I come to Howard. I feel like, in a sense, that I'm coming to my alma mater. I happen to be an honorary alumnus of Howard University, so that I always come here not as a stranger, but as one who loves this institution of learning, and as one who has a deep sense of gratitude for all that Howard University has done for the cultural life of our nation, and not only our nation, but for the whole world. So I want to thank Dr. Nelson for inviting me, and Dr. Wormley for his very kind and gracious words. And I'm indeed honored to share the platform tonight with representatives from 4 organizations who have been recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize. It's also good to be on this campus on the occasion of the centennial celebration.
Why did Amazon send me $20,000? Because I use Amazon AI. I'm going to show.
As you know, it is not a common thing for an institution to survive 100 years. Some survive, others do not. But Howard University has stood 100 years, but it has not only survived 100 years, it has survived with purpose, with creativity, and with great contributions to the life of our nation. And so I do want to express my congratulations to Howard University, to the president, to all of the members of the faculty, and all of the students for all of the great things that have been done here across the years. The theme for this meeting tonight, for this period, is Pathways to Peace. And I would like to talk with you rather informally, and I hope candidly, about the struggle for racial justice in the United States. Now, I use that subject because I don't think it is separated, I don't think it is divorced from the main theme. For I happen to feel that the struggle for peace and the struggle for justice are inextricably bound together. There can be no peace ultimately without justice, and there can be no justice without peace. And so I want to talk with you about a struggle that you are all aware of, that you are all involved in, a struggle that engulfs our whole nation, and that is a struggle for racial justice. I guess the most persistent and at points the most poignant question that I receive as I talk with people, as I talk with reporters all over this nation, is the question whether we are making any real progress in the struggle for racial justice. And I always try to answer that question by avoiding, on the one hand, what I consider a deadening pessimism, but by avoiding, on the other hand, what I consider a kind of superficial optimism. And I try to answer the question by presenting a realistic position which seeks to combine the truths of two opposites while avoiding the extremes of both. And so as we look at this question, as we seek to answer this question, I would like to say, on the one hand, that we've made significant strides in the struggle to make racial justice a reality in our nation. But on the other hand, we still have a long, long way to go before the problem is solved. And it is this realistic position that I would like to use as a basis for our thinking together tonight. We have come a long, long way, but we have a long, long way to go. Now, let me begin by saying that we've made significant strides. And I think the first thing I can point out at this point is that the Negro himself has come a long, long way in re-evaluating his own intrinsic worth. Now, in order to illustrate this, a little history is necessary. You will remember that it was in the year of 1619 when the first Negro slaves landed on the shores of this nation. They were brought here from the soils of Africa. And unlike the Pilgrim Fathers who landed at Plymouth a year later, they were brought here against their will. And throughout slavery, the Negro was treated in a very inhuman fashion. He was a thing to be used, not a person to be respected. And the famous Dred Scott decision of 1857 well illustrated the status of the Negro during slavery. In this decision, the Supreme Court of the United States said in substance that the Negro is not a citizen of the United States. He is merely property, subject to the dictates of his owner. And it went on to say that the Negro has no rights that the white man is bound to respect. And with the growth of slavery, it became necessary to give some justification for it. It seems to be a fact of life that human beings cannot continue to do wrong without eventually reaching out for some thin rationalization to clothe an obvious wrong in the beautiful garments of righteousness. And this is exactly what happened. Even the Bible and religion were used, or I should say misused, to crystallize the patterns of the status quo and to justify many prejudices and misdeeds that were taking place. And so it was argued from some pulpits that the Negro was inferior by nature because of Noah's curse upon the children of Ham. The Apostle Paul's dictum became a watchword: servants, be obedient to your master.
The dewy skin cream from Tatcha, with a rich, creamy feel. For plump.
And one brother had probably read the logic of the great philosopher Aristotle. You will remember that Aristotle did a great deal to bring into being what we now know as formal logic in philosophy. And in formal logic, you have a big word known as the syllogism. And in the syllogism, you have a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. And so this brother decided to put his argument of the inferiority of the Negro in the framework of an Aristotelian syllogism. He came out with his major premise, all men are made in the image of God. Then came his minor premise, God, as everybody knows, is not a Negro, therefore the Negro is not a man. This was the kind of reasoning that prevailed. Well, living with the conditions of slavery and then later racial segregation, many Negroes lost faith in themselves. Many came to feel that perhaps they were less than human. But then something happened to the Negro. Circumstances made it possible and necessary for him to travel more. The coming of the automobile, the upheavals of 2 world wars, the Great Depression. And so his rural plantation background gradually gave way to urban industrial life. His cultural life was gradually rising through the steady decline of crippling illiteracy. And all of these forces conjoined to cause the Negro to take a new look at himself. Negro masses all over began to reevaluate themselves, and the Negro came to feel that he was somebody. His religion revealed to him that God loves all of his children, and that the basic thing about a man is not his specificity, but his fundamentum, not the texture of his hair or the color of his skin, but his eternal dignity and worth. And so the Negro can now unconsciously cry out with the eloquent poet, fleecy locks and black complexion cannot forfeit nature's claim. Skin may differ, but affection dwells in black and white the same. And if I were so tall as to reach the pole, or to grasp the ocean at a span, I must be measured by my soul. The mind is the standard of the man. And with this new sense of dignity and this new sense of self-respect, a new Negro came into being with a new determination to struggle, to suffer, to sacrifice, and even die if necessary in order to be free. And so in a real sense, we've come a long, long way since 1619. But not only has the Negro come a long, long way in reevaluating his own intrinsic worth, if we are true to the facts, we would have to admit that the whole nation has made significant strides in extending the frontiers of democracy and the frontiers of civil rights. Certainly not as far as it should be, and I will discuss that, but we've made some strides. And I would say that the area in which we've made the greatest strides is in the area of really bringing an end, or at least weakening the barriers of legal segregation. Now, we all know the long history of legal segregation in our country. It had its legal beginning in 1896 when the Supreme Court of the nation rendered a decision known as the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. This decision established the doctrine of separate but equal as the law of the land. Of course, we all know what happened as a result of the old Plessy doctrine. There was always a strict enforcement of the separate, without the slightest intention to abide by the equal. And the Negro ended up being plunged into the abyss of exploitation, where he experienced the bleakness of nagging injustice. But then something else happened. It was in the year 1954 on May 17th. After examining the legal body of segregation, the Supreme Court of our nation pronounced it constitutionally dead. It said in substance that the old Plessy doctrine must go, that separate facilities are inherently unequal, and that to segregate a child on the basis of his race is to deny that child equal protection of the law. Many other things happened after that to bring changes about. After the Supreme Court's decision, which brought about the legal turning point, we saw a year later the psychological turning point developing when the people themselves decided to act and demand the rights that were now on paper. And so in Montgomery, Alabama, 50,000 Negroes decided that it was ultimately more honorable to walk in dignity than to ride segregated buses in humiliation. And so they substituted tired feet for tired souls and walked the streets of that city until the sagging walls of bus segregation 381 days later were finally crushed by the battering rams of the forces of justice. And then as the years unfolded, around 1960, the student sit-in movement started. And this was a great movement because it reminded the nation of something. When students all over the nation, all over the South, all over the District of Columbia, wherever they existed, started sitting in at segregated lunch counters, segregated places of public accommodation, they were in reality standing up for the best in the American dream and carrying the whole nation back to those great wells of democracy, which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the formulation of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And as a result of this movement, more than 300 cities desegregated lunch counters and other areas of public accommodations. In 1961 came the Freedom Rides. And as a result of this, we saw the end of segregation in interstate travel. In 1962 and 3, movements took place in Albany, Georgia, and Birmingham, Alabama. And after that Birmingham movement, something happened to literally subpoena the conscience of a large segment of the nation to appear before the judgment seat of morality on the whole question of civil rights. And so out of that, and as a result of that, a civil rights being came into being in 1964. And then in 1965, the Selma, Alabama movement took place, which dealt with the whole question of the denial of the right to vote. And after this movement, a voting rights bill came into being, and that bill was written with the pen and ink of human sacrifice. All of these things represented legislative strides, judicial victories, which did a great deal to rectify long-standing evils in the southern part of the United States. And so in a real sense, as a result of these movements, we have made significant steps forward in many areas. To put it figuratively in biblical language, we've broken loose from the Egypt of slavery, and we have moved through the wilderness of legal segregation. And now we stand on the border of the promised land of integration. We've come a long, long way since 1896. Now, this would be a wonderful place for me to end my lecture this evening. First, it would mean giving a rather short lecture, and that would be a magnificent accomplishment for a Baptist preacher. But second, it would mean that the problem is about solved now. You know, it would be a wonderful thing if speakers all over our nation could talk about this problem in terms of a problem that once existed, but that no longer has existence. But you see, if I stop at this point, I will merely be stating a fact and not telling the truth. You know, a fact is merely the absence of contradiction. But I learned from Dr. Brightman and Dr. DeWolf, my professor at Boston University, who's here tonight, that truth, as Hegel would say it, is the presence of coherence. Truth is the relatedness of facts. Now, it's a fact that we've come a long, long way, but it isn't the whole truth. And if I stop at this point, I'm afraid that I will leave you the victims. I'm afraid that I will leave you the victims of a dangerous optimism, and all of us will find ourselves the victims of an illusion wrapped in superficiality. So in order to tell the truth, it is necessary to move on and say that before the problem of racial injustice is solved in our nation, we still have a long, long way to go. Now, we don't have to look very far to see this. We need only open our newspapers, turn on our televisions, or just look around in our communities. And things are happening every day. To cause us to know that we are far from the promised land in the area of racial justice. Things are still happening to reveal this in every section of our country. We still see it in the South. We still see, for instance, tragic and notorious violence. In many areas of our country today, the murder of Negroes and white civil rights workers is still a popular pastime. Over the last few years, I would say in the last 4 years, figures reveal that in Alabama and Mississippi, more than 74 Negroes and white persons have been brutally murdered. It's related to the civil rights movement, and not a single person has been convicted. This tells us that we have a long, long way to go. In Mississippi, over the last 20 months, some 58 Negro churches have been burned to the ground. It seems that they have a new motto in Mississippi now: not attend the church of your choice, but burn the church of your choice. All of this tells us that something tragic is still alive in our nation. But that isn't the only thing. It is one thing to lynch an individual physically. This is tragic. This is brutal. This is vicious. But that is another kind of brutality that is just as pernicious to the individuals involved, and that is to lynch individuals spiritually. And this is what we find today all over our nation, that Negroes by the millions are still being lynched and murdered spiritually. We can go into any of our cities and the story is the same. Millions of Negroes hovered up into ghettos, finding themselves having to live in rat-infested, vermin-filled slums. More than 40% of the Negro families of our country live in substandard, dilapidated, deteriorating housing conditions where they don't have wall-to-wall carpet, but wall-to-wall rats and roaches. This is a fact of life for millions of our brothers and our sisters. We see it in the area of education. We see the problem growing every day. The fact is that the schools in the North are more segregated today than they were 30 years ago. In Chicago, where we've been working in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference over the last several months, 92% of the Negro students attend school with 94% of students of their own race, which means that the schools are almost totally segregated. And this means that many social problems are created. And the fact is that thousands and thousands of Negro students finish high school every year reading at a 6th grade level, not because they are dumb, not because they do not have the native intelligence, but because the schools are so inadequate, because the schools are so overcrowded, because the schools are so devoid of quality, that the great potentialities residing within these young people never reach the realm of actuality. These are the facts of everyday life in all of our cities across the nation. Not only do we see it in housing, not only do we see it in education, probably the most critical area is the economic area. The Negro still finds himself perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. And that economic problem is more critical today than it has ever been. Certainly there has been progress Within the Negro middle class, jobs have come, positions have been given and reached, and we have seen day to day and week to week progress within the Negro middle class. But when we look at the vast majority of the masses of Negroes, we find that in the economic area, the Negro is worse off today than he was 20 years ago. 20 or 25 years ago, the unemployment rate among Negroes and whites was about the same. Today, nationally, 2 Negroes unemployed to every 1 white, and it has almost moved now to 3 Negroes unemployed to every 1 white. And we can see it in terms of the median annual income. The median annual income for the average white family in the United States is today about $6,864, while for Negro families it's about $3,336. Here we see a tragic gulf, and this gulf is widening every day. I was reading just the other day that the unemployment rate among white youth 18 and 19 decreased 4% in the month of June of this year, while the unemployment rate among Negro youth of the same age increased about 5%. So these are the problems. It's unemployment on the one hand, but the other problem is underemployment. People generally feel that the poverty-stricken people of our country, people who are unemployed, the fact is that most of the poverty-stricken people in the Negro community are people who are working every day, but earning so little that they cannot purchase the basic necessities of life. And so this is a problem that is very real in the economic area. Now we can see all of the social problems that are created as a result of this. The deeper this problem develops, the more it leads to frustration, the more it leads to bitterness, the more it leads to despair, the more it causes individuals to feel that life is a long and desolate corridor with no exit sign. And that is nothing more dangerous than to build a society with a large segment of individuals in that society who feel that they have no stake in it, who feel that they have nothing to lose. These are the individuals who will riot. These are the individuals who will listen to words of nonviolence, but allow them to fall on deaf ears. And I, for one, will always take a stand against violence and riots, because I feel firmly that riots create many more social problems than they solve. I feel that they are self-defeating and they are socially destructive. I feel that they only intensify the fears of large segments of the white community while relieving the guilt. So I will take a stand constantly against riots. But people of goodwill and of social vision must be as firm in condemning the conditions which persist in our society and which cause individuals to feel that they have no alternative but to engage in such misguided and unfortunate tragic action in order to get attention. The fact is that a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the economic plight, as I just said, of the Negro poor has worsened over the last several years. It has failed to hear that the rising expectations of freedom and justice have not been met. It has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice and humanity. And so our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. And as long as there is that delay, as long as there is that failure to bring into full realization the promises of democracy, we will find ourselves sinking into darker nights of social disruption. And so it is necessary to deal with all of these problems passionately and unrelentingly. It is necessary to go this additional distance in order to make brotherhood a reality. Now, let me suggest just 2 or 3 things that must be done in our nation, seems to me, in order to make racial justice a reality, in order to go this additional distance. Let me say that it is necessary for all people of goodwill to engage in a massive action program to solve many of the problems that I just mentioned. These problems aren't going to work themselves out. It will be necessary for the forces of goodwill of our nation to work with determination to solve them. Now, at this point, I would like to mention that we should go all out to grapple with the economic problem that we face in the Negro community and the economic problem that the poor people of our nation face generally. I don't think this is too much to ask. I don't think it is too much to say to America. If you're serious about getting rid of slums, that if you're serious about getting rid of blight, that if you're serious about getting rid of joblessness, if you're serious about getting rid of economic insecurity, that you will put at least $10 billion a year into a massive program to deal with all of these problems that have accumulated as a result of the legacy of slavery and racial segregation. $10 billion, $12 billion, $15 billion, that isn't too much to ask, for after all, our nation has a national gross product this year of some $740 billion. And think about that. We are the richest nation on earth, the richest nation in the history of the world. And so the question is not whether we have the resources, we have them. Not whether we have the know-how, we have it. Not whether we have the techniques in America, we have the techniques. The question is whether America has the will. And if our nation can spend $800 a second, $2 billion a week, $24 billion a year to fight a war in Vietnam, and $20 billion to put a man on the moon, it seems to me that this same nation can spend billions of dollars to put God's children on their own 2 feet right here on earth. And I must frankly say that so often I come to the conclusion that forces in our nation are much more concerned about winning the war in Vietnam than they are about winning the war against poverty right here at home. And this is a tragedy. And so we must develop a program to keep this issue before the conscience of the nation, making it palpably clear that this economic problem must be solved if we are to be the great nation that we are called to be. If we are to be the great nation of justice and brotherhood, we must deal with this problem. And certainly the resources, as I said, are here. And God never intended for some of his children to live in inordinate, superfluous wealth, while others live in abject, deadening poverty. And he's left enough and to spare in this world for all of his children to have the basic necessities of life. And we must keep this before the attention of our nation. Now, as we keep this issue alive, we must be prepared for the difficulties ahead. And when I say being prepared for the difficulties ahead, we must face the fact that we are now in the most difficult phase of the civil rights struggle. Or if we want to call it the human rights struggle, that's all right with me. But we are in the most difficult phase of that struggle. People talk about the white backlash. You hear a lot about that, and we've heard a lot about it today and yesterday because we're in this election period. Now, my answer to this question is that there's really no white backlash, because that gives the impression that the nation had decided it was going to solve this problem, and that the nation had really decided that justice should be granted to the Negro in all dimensions. And then there was a step back because of developments in the civil rights movement. Now, the fact is that America has been backlashing on the civil rights question for centuries now. And the Negro knows this, and white people of goodwill know this. On the Statue of Liberty, we read that this nation is the mother of exiles. Yes, we do know that it is the mother of exiles, but the fact is that we must face is that it has been the mother of white exiles, but for its black exiles, it has often been an arena of bondage and despair, so that the Negro in the darkest days of his life, and even to this day, has to sing, "Sometimes I feel like a motherless child," because he knows that the nation hadn't been that mother that he needed. And so the backlash is merely the surfacing of prejudices, hostilities, hatreds, and fears that already existed, and they're just now coming out in the open. And this must be faced factually. And that fact is that demands are being made now that the nation wasn't willing to give in on in the very beginning. Public accommodations didn't cost the nation anything. The right to vote didn't cost the nation anything. But now we are grappling with basic class issues between the privileged and the underprivileged. And in order to solve this problem, not only will it mean a restructuring of the architecture of American society, but it will cost the nation something. And the backlash is just responding to the fact that now we're saying everybody ought to have a job, and everybody ought to have a guaranteed annual income, and everybody ought to have the right to live in a decent house and anywhere that he wants to live, and everybody ought to have an adequate education. This is the problem, that there are those who are not willing to do this. And in the civil rights movement, we must be prepared to face this moment, because we are in the most difficult phase of the struggle. But I still believe that in facing this, we can go on in the days ahead with that massive struggle, that massive action program that can bring about a real solution to this problem. I want to mention next in this action program that in order to deal with the problem, we've got to deal with, get rid of what I refer to so often, I guess I mentioned it here before, as the myth of time. Now, you've heard this. It's the notion that only time can solve the problem that we face in the area of racial injustice. And there are those, and often kind of sincere people, who say to Negroes and their allies in the white community, just be nice and patient and continue to pray, and in 100 or 200 years, the problem will work itself out, that only time can solve the problem. Well, that is a myth involved here, and that is an answer to this myth. And that is that time is neutral. It can be used either constructively or destructively. And I must say to you tonight, my friends, that I'm convinced that the forces of ill will in our nation have often used time much more effectively than the forces of goodwill. And we may well have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words and the violent actions of the bad people who will bomb a church in Birmingham, Alabama, but we will have to repent for the appalling silence and indifference of the good people who sit around and say, wait on time. Somewhere we must come to see that human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals who are willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. And so we must help time, and we must realize that the time is always right to do right. Somewhere Edmund Burke said, when bad men combine, good men must unite. And this is a great challenge facing America. When bad men plot, good men must plan. When bad men burn and bomb, good men must build and bind. When bad men would shout tragic words of hatred, good men must proclaim the glories of love. When bad men would seek to preserve an unjust status quo, good men must seek to bring into being a just social order. And so no longer can we live with the myth of time. It is necessary to use time creatively and constructively. And that is another myth that gets around. And that is the notion that legislation can't solve the problem that we face in the area of racial injustice, because you've got to change the heart. and that you can't change the heart through issuing an executive order or by having a decision by the Supreme Court, or you can't change the heart by getting a law written on the books. I guess there's some truth in that. There's certainly some truth in the fact that if we are to solve the problems that we face in the area of racial injustice, people are going to have to change their hearts eventually. If we're going to have a truly brotherly society, it's certainly true that men will have to rise to the point of being obedient to the unenforceable. I would be the first one to say that. But after bringing this out, it is necessary to bring the other side. And that is that it may be true that morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It may be true that the law can't make a man love me, but it can restrain him from lynching me, and I think that's pretty important also. And so while the law may not change the hearts of men, it does change the habits of men. And when you change the habits of men, pretty soon behavioral patterns will be changed, attitudes will be changed, and hopefully hearts will be changed. And it is necessary to see that we need civil rights legislation, but that isn't enough. After it comes into being, it must be vigorously enforced in order to end the long night of discrimination that we face in so many areas of our nation. And that is another point that I would like to mention that is vital in the days ahead. It is a point that we must bring out because I believe firmly that in our quest to bring about a society of justice, that society of justice is at bottom a society of brotherhood. And so this leads me to say that we must see black and white alike, that our destinies are tied together, that somehow the destiny of the white man is inextricably bound with the destiny of the black man, and the destiny of the black man is inextricably bound with the destiny of the white man. These are facts of life, however much we try to romanticize it and say something different. The fact is that we are tied together, whether we want to be or not. Our language, our cultural patterns, our material prosperity, our music, and even our food are an amalgam of black and white. And it just so happens, whether anybody likes it, it's a fact that every black man is a little white and every white man is a little black. And the fact is that there can never be any separate black path to power and fulfillment that does not intersect white roots. And there can never be any separate white path to power and fulfillment short of social disaster that does not recognize the need and necessity to share that power with black aspirations for freedom and human dignity. Somehow we are all tied together in a single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. The Negro needs the white man to save him from his fears. The white man needs a black man to save him from his guilt. John Donne was right. No man is an island in time of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. And he goes on toward the end to say, any man's death diminishes me because I'm involved in mankind. Therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. One day in America we will see that. And when we see it, we will rise to great and noble heights. We will come to see that black and white together we shall and we must overcome. And this is a great challenge facing this nation at this hour. And let me say in conclusion that our goal is freedom. And I believe firmly that we're going to get there. I believe this because ultimately, in spite of its shortcomings, in spite of the deferred dreams that we have experienced and the blasted hopes, the goal of America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with the destiny of America. Before the Pilgrim Fathers landed at Plymouth, we were here. Before Jefferson etched across the pages of history the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence, we were here. Before the beautiful words of the Star-Spangled Banner were written, we were here. And for more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored here without wages. They made cotton king, and they built the homes of their masters in the midst of the most oppressive and humiliating conditions. And yet out of a bottomless vitality, they continue to grow and develop. And I say to you this evening that if the inexpressible cruelties of slavery couldn't stop us, the opposition that we now face, including the so-called white backlash, will surely fail. We're going to win our freedom because both the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of the Almighty God are embodied in our echoing demands. And so with this faith, we go out to build a brighter tomorrow. We're going to win our freedom because Carlyle is right. No lie can live forever. We're going to win our freedom because William Cullen Bryant is right. Truth-crushed earth will rise again. We're going to win our freedom because James Russell Lowell is right. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future. And so with this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to speed up the day when justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And so the challenge of the hour is for America to rise up, not next week, not next month, not even an hour from now, but rise up at this moment to make justice a reality, and for every black man and woman, boy and girl, to rise up and be a participant in this great drama taking place on American history. Rise up at this moment, recognizing a tiny little minute, just 60 seconds in it. I didn't choose it. I can't refuse it. It's up to me to use it. A tiny little minute, just 60 seconds in it, but eternity is in it. And this is a challenge facing America. Thank you.
The ushers will be glad if you do not have any paper to provide you with paper, even a pencil, I expect, if that may be necessary. Struggle against the injustices suffered by the people of South Africa, the dark-skinned of South Africa. He was confined and today is confined to a little farm from which he cannot leave without the consent of his government. In 1960, the Nobel Committee in Oslo reached down and picked Mr. Luthuli out and brought him to Oslo, where he received a Nobel Peace Prize. One of the first persons we invited to come and participate in this conference was Albert John Luthuli. We received a letter from Mr. Luthuli, and it read something like this. I thank you and your committee for honoring me with an invitation to visit the United States of America to participate in the celebration of the 100th anniversary of Howard University as one of the guest speakers under the auspices of the Gandhi Memorial Lecture. I would like to be part of this historic gathering. I recall with happy memories my fleeting visit to Howard University when I visited the United States in 1948 under the joint invitation of the American Board and North American Missionary Conference. I have given much prayerful thought to your invitation, but I regret that I cannot come. You will understand why he could not come. Prime Minister Lester Pearson of Canada received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1957. We invited him to be present at this conference, but he found that he could not because during this period, he is very busily engaged with government affairs. But he did send this message. It is a most happy coincidence that the centennial of Howard University should be celebrated on the eve of our Canadian centennial. Such an occasion is a time in my country, as I'm sure it is a time in your university, for pausing to reflect on the lessons of the past, that they may be a benefit to the present and to the future. As your university marks its 100 years, it is appropriate that your centennial conference should be preoccupied with pathways to peace. I'm sure that your deliberations on this all-important subject will be most imaginative and constructive. I congratulate you and wish you many more centuries of success. It was also our very great hope to have as a participant in this conference Dr. Ralph Bunche. We all know Dr. Bunche. He could not come, particularly because the Assembly, United Nations Assembly is in session, and he felt he could not leave. But I received this telegram just 2 nights ago. Please forgive me for having failed to send the message earlier as promised, as I had planned. But I know that you will understand that I have been greatly shaken and distraught recently and really have not been able to put my mind to matters such as this. Nevertheless, I do wish to extend warmest congratulations and my best wishes to Howard University on the occasion of its centennial. The university has a unique position in American higher education and has played a highly significant role. Its future can only be great. Ralph Bunche. Now are the persons, we have a panel on each side here which is looking at the questions, and as they have made selections, we'll be glad to take them and present them to Dr. Keene. Yes.
I think the first question I have here is how can we Negroes, middle class is in parentheses, offer our help to raise the poverty-stricken? That's a very good question because I think we all have to work together to deal with the problem of poverty. And as we all know, it's a very serious problem in our country. I don't think there's any way to solve the problem of poverty in our country without having the kind of massive effort that I tried to mention earlier. Now, I don't think it's going to be solved, for instance, with token programs here and there. I think the poverty program is certainly a good faith start. But the program, as we now know it and as we now have it in our nation, is so small in terms of the dollar output that it can't even begin to grapple with the problem of poverty. What it so often does is to lift the aspirations and the hopes of the poverty-stricken, only to leave them with these hopes blasted because the program can't fulfill the hopes and can't really grapple with hardcore poverty. So I think we need a program much larger than the present war on poverty, which only has a budget of about $1,700,000,000 for the coming year. I think, as I said, that we've got to develop a program which has enough money to, in fact, deal with the problem of slum housing, to, in fact, make jobs a reality with adequate income for all of the unemployed. And this would have to come through massive public works programs and massive training programs. It would demand an even greater raising of the minimum wage. It ought to be at least $2 an hour. And then it would also require, it seems to me, thinking of something that we have not thought of too much in our nation, and that is a guaranteed annual income for all poor people, so that there would be an economic floor beneath which no one would fall, no family economically. Now, naturally, this isn't going to be done by talking about it. It's got to be done as a result of programs that are geared in that direction. And I think the Negro middle class can be very important in such a program by providing a great deal of the know-how, by providing a great deal of the research that will be needed in order to really develop the programs on paper, but also by providing the supportive action that will be necessary in order to bring these matters before our cities. And it needs to be brought out in all of our major cities and to the federal government. And I believe that the Negro middle class can do a great deal at that point. Plus, the Negro middle class being more economically secure than the poverty-stricken Negroes of our country can do a great deal to give support economically to the organizations that are out in the forefront of the struggle to bring these issues before the conscience of the nation. Every civil rights organization needs financial support, and the Negro middle class certainly hadn't given the kind of financial support to these organizations that they need. So I think these are some of the things that can be done in order to move on toward the day of dealing with the problem of poverty. The next question, please give your viewpoint on black power. I knew I'd get that question at Howard University. I think there are two sides or 2 points that can be brought out at this point, and I always speak frankly and honestly, and I think you know my position. As a leader, I must be concerned about the problem of semantics and the use of words. I find a great deal to agree with and to sympathize with in the concept of black power, and I'll tell you what I think that concept should mean. But the slogan, I find it very difficult to deal with because I think it's an unfortunate use of words, not because the concept may not have some positive, valuable principles, but because the connotations, and every English major knows that every word has a connotative and a denotative meaning, and I find no difficulty when it is properly interpreted with the denotative meaning of black power, but the connotative meaning, I think, can be very unfortunate. When you put the word black and power together, it gives the impression that you mean black domination rather than black equality because of what power means to most people. Now, certainly, I think there is a need for power in the black community. If there's any problem that the Negro faces in America, it is that he is powerless economically and politically. And anybody who knows the ghetto knows that the ghetto is an arena of powerlessness brought into being to a large extent to preserve the powerlessness of the Negro. And certainly he has to rise from this position of powerlessness to a position of creative and positive power. So that if by black power we mean amassing political and economic power to achieve our legitimate goals, then this is a kind of legitimate power that I think all people of good will recognize and recognize our need for. I think there's another thing that to me is very important, and I've been trying to preach it for a long time, and that is that the Negro has been devoid in so many instances of the kind of sense, the sense of somebodyness that he needs. The system has done this to the American Negro, so that the Negro so often has not had a sense of appreciation for his heritage. He has not had the racial pride. He's often been ashamed of himself. He's been ashamed of being black. He's been ashamed of being a Negro. And this has been very tragic. And if there's any one thing that the Negro needs more than anything is a sense of dignity, a sense of self-respect, and a feeling of somebodyness. And certainly he needs a feeling that he should not be ashamed of being black, because black is as beautiful as any other color. So I think it's very important. So all of these things, I think we've got to work on, we've got to accept. Now, the other side is this, that the connotations can often be bad. And I think that while the philosopher of a slogan like this may not mean that, when it falls on unsophisticated ears, it can often mean violence, it can often mean get whitey, and it can often mean many things that the originators do not mean. Certainly, if black power means a kind of black separatism that does not recognize the impracticality of such a course, it is something that I could never accept. If it means a kind of turning to violence and rioting as a means of gaining justice, and I couldn't accept that, because I think it's both impractical and immoral for the Negro to even think of violence as a solution to the problem. And I won't spend a long time arguing that. I always, as I talk about power, we need it, and power is nothing but the ability to achieve purpose, and that's constructive and legitimate. But also we must recognize that power is the right use of strength. And if we don't recognize that, Lord Acton is right, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I certainly don't want to see the Negro turn around and do to anybody what has happened to him, because that's one aspect of the lowest element in white society that I don't mean to imitate. And it seems to me that we've got to see those. How important is it for the various civil rights groups to be united in our quest for equality? Well, I can answer that very quickly by saying I think we can achieve much more through unity than we can achieve through disunity. This is something that I believe all of us would recognize. Now, that does not mean that we have to have uniformity. There can be unity where there is not uniformity. And I feel that we should continue to search for the kind of unity that we need in the civil rights movement, because many of the opponents of civil rights are very happy when they feel that there is disunity in the very center of the movement. And I think we ought to go all out to achieve this unity. Now, it may mean that in achieving this unity, we recognize that the various organizations will have different points of emphasis, but it does not mean that we're going down a different path. It seems that we should all be moving down the same road. It may be a three-lane highway, so to speak, but all moving in the same direction toward the same goal. So I would answer that by saying that I think it is very important to have unity within the civil rights movement. And if there are waverings, or if it appears that we do not have unity, I think it is needed. I think it's necessary for us to search for it at this time. To what do you attribute the apathy of the civil rights movements on Negro colleges, I guess that's on Negro college campuses as a whole? Well, I would say first that this apathy, if there is apathy alive now, it certainly hasn't always existed, because the colleges and the universities furnished great leadership and great support for the civil rights struggle from the days from 1960 on up. And that was a generation, a period when students by the thousands expressed themselves, engaged in the kind of creative activity that kept this issue alive and kept it before the nation and dramatized it in a very significant way. So that if there is apathy, it is something that has recently developed. What accounts for this is difficult to say. I think that it may be true that in life you do go through these moments which you refer to on the one hand as peak moments of united activity and valley moments of dissent and debate and indeed dissension sometimes. And when you come to these valley moments, it leads to general apathy in many conditions. Also, I think that many people felt that after the Civil Rights Bill of 64 and then the Voting Rights Bill of 65, that we had solved the civil rights problem in the United States. And it was as simple as that they looked at that legislation, and so many people became complacent. And I found this not only in the white community, but many Negroes felt that after the Civil Rights Bill of 64 and the Voting Rights Bill of 65, that we had about solved the problem. And I think that has brought about some apathy within certain segments of our society. But the problem is, as you well know, that these legislative victories did a great deal to rectify long-standing evils of the South, but they did very little to improve the lot of the millions of Negroes in the teeming ghettos of the I think this says, as an individual white, I am a law student here at Howard. Would you recommend how I may best avail myself to advance the human rights of my black brothers? I think there are two or three things. First, as a lawyer, you will have a great deal of work you can do, both while in school and after receiving your law degree. As you know, a lot of our struggle has of necessity been involved in the courts. Fortunately, this university has given to our nation the leading lawyers in the civil rights movement, and certainly the leading constitutional lawyers of our nation have come from this very institution of learning. And I don't see a day in the very near future where we will not need lawyers to constantly aid us in our many struggles. And many have volunteered their services. They have given their time to support the civil rights movement in terms of giving legal support. So that is one way to become involved. There are many legal arms to the civil rights movement that I won't take the time to mention, but you could certainly work with these particular legal arms. I think the other thing is that there will be activities, I'm sure, right here in Washington to improve conditions in the slums and in the ghetto of the city. They will need a great deal of work, legal work. I was talking with my good friend and co-worker, Reverend Fauntleroy, who has a project underway here that will seek to rehabilitate a whole community, the shore area of the city. And you can think of the expertise that will be needed to do this big job, to go all out to improve conditions and rehabilitate a whole community. And there will be many other activities right here in the District of Columbia that all people of goodwill in school or professors or out of school can participate in, volunteer their services for. And then, you know, there's another thing I don't like about Washington, and that is that I love Washingtonians, and you all can't vote here. And other than a presidential election, I think you ought to be able to vote and get you a mayor and a city council. You need home rule in Washington. And if there isn't some real activity around this whole question of home rule and keeping it before the Congress, Washington won't get home rule soon. And there needs to be leadership on this, and you have that, as well as the support of people all over the city, a coalition of conscience to make home rule a reality right here in Washington. And certainly law students and other students can participate in this kind of movement. Are there others? All right. All right, there's one more question, and then we will be through. What can we learn from the experience of Mahatma Gandhi, which will give direction at this stage in our struggle for civil rights? I think, as I have said before, that the method of nonviolent resistance is, to my mind, the most potent weapon available to the Negro in his struggle for freedom and human dignity. Now, as you know, Mahatma Gandhi pioneered in this method, and through using this particular approach, he finally brought his people, the Indian people, to the day of independence where they were able to break loose from the political domination and the economic exploitation of the British Empire. I still believe that we can learn this in a very significant way from Gandhi, and I believe that it is still the most important course of action for the American Negro. Now, it's very important to learn and to know that when Gandhi talks about nonviolent resistance, he isn't talking about doing nothing. And so often people feel that it's a kind of do-nothing, cowardly method. And this isn't what Gandhi meant at all, and anybody who has studied his life and his activities will realize that nonviolent resistance does resist. One of the basic principles that Gandhi always brought out was that only an evil man will adjust himself to evil. Only an evil man will cooperate with evil. And it is just as important to see today, as Gandhi saw and as he saw it reading Thoreau, that non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. So the nonviolent resistance doesn't mean sitting down, doing nothing, merely accepting evil, but it means standing up courageously against evil, but recognizing that it is not tactically sound, nor morally excellent to engage in violence in the process, because the minute this happens, it only intensifies the existence of violence in the situation, and it really doesn't solve the social problem. So the only thing I can say in answer to this question is that we must delve deeper into nonviolence and into this method, and I believe that it is the way. The fact is that even if it were not immoral, we have neither the techniques nor the instruments to win a violent campaign in the United States of America. It is just the fact that we have to realize that never in history has a violent minority won a victory over a power or numerical majority unless there was sympathy on a broad scale within that majority for those who were using violence. It may be that in the American Revolution, it was a minority of people who were actually in the war and in the army, but they had the sympathy of the vast majority of the American people. It may be that a Castro was in the hills with a numerical minority in Cuba, but he had the sympathy of the vast majority of the non-resisting, the others who were not fighting the Batista regime. But the fact is that in the United States of America, if the Negro started his campaign of violence, first, Negroes not united on violence, so that the 10% would be divided, and then the other 90 would be totally against it, and we couldn't get nowhere but following a kind of nihilistic course of disruption for disruption's sake, and it just ends up solving any problem. I remember in Chicago this summer, there was a riot, and it did, a riot sometimes causes them to stop and look. But they didn't give us nothing but a sprinkler system or something, and then they used the riot as a means to try to, get off the hook and as an excuse for inaction. Then we, a month later, decided that we were still going to remain true to our nonviolent principles, and we did that. And we got together and we organized a nonviolent movement on housing. We started demonstrating around this issue. And we demonstrated and demonstrated. We stood up firmly with courage, with morality, with power. And then the power structure of Chicago came to see that it had to capitulate. And as a result of that nonviolent movement, we were able to get a little more than a sprinkler system here and there. But we had the whole power structure of Chicago to sit down and work out an agreement whereby we would have the most comprehensive open housing proposal ever worked out by any city. And I still think that nonviolence is the most powerful and the most effective instrument that the Negro has in his struggle in the United States of America.
The people of India are very interested in what we in America are making out of nonviolence. They are interested from the distance, and those who are in Washington are interested. We have present tonight Dr. Banerjee, Minister of the Indian Embassy, and in the absence of the ambassador, the Chargé d'Affaires. He is here to represent the Indian community and to wish us well in our thinking about this particular method in winning the wider freedom of our people in this country. We welcome Dr. Banerjee tonight. Now, ladies and gentlemen, one wonders how we can thank Dr. King for what he has